6 months, maybe 8 if you respond well to treatment. I'm sorry.
Does my son know I'm even here?
We called him. He is on his way.
6 months, the doctor says, standing at the foot of the bed because some news doesn't get easier to hear sitting down. Maybe 8 if you respond well to treatment. I'm sorry. The room doesn't make a sound for a long moment. No monitor beeping in sync with anything that feels like relief. No family member gasping, nobody reaching for his hand, because there isn't a single other person in the room to do it. Doyun Park is 61 years old, worth more money than most countries move in a fiscal quarter, and he hears the worst sentence of his life alone, in a hospital gown that doesn't fit him, with nobody beside him but a doctor who has clearly delivered this exact sentence to strangers more times than she'd like to count. He built a shipping empire from nothing but a single rusted freighter and a father who told him it would fail. And none of that, not one contract, not one acquisition, not 1 0 on a balance sheet, buys him a single extra week of what the scan on the screen beside him is quietly, patiently telling 2 people in that room, and no one else. Doyun doesn't cry. He doesn't ask the questions most people ask. Why me? How long exactly? Is there anything we haven't tried? He asks only one thing, staring at the ceiling of a hospital room paid for by money he built with his own 2 hands. Does my son know I'm even here? The doctor hesitates just long enough to answer the question before she says a single word. Because the truth is, at this point in this hospital, nobody in his family knows anything at all. Not that he's sick, not that he's dying, not even that he stopped breathing normally enough to be here in the first place. And that gap, between a man learning he has months left and the people who share his blood having no idea he's even in a hospital bed, is the first thing you need to understand about the story before anything else makes sense. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click subscribe so you never miss what we post next, because this story only gets heavier from here. 12 hours earlier, he'd collapsed in the elevator on the 41st floor, and by the time the doors opened, Doyun Park was already unconscious on the marble floor of his own headquarters, one shoe off, his briefcase spilled open beside him like it was trying to walk away from what just happened. 2 security guards reached him before anyone from his own family did. That single detail, that the people paid to protect the building got to him faster than the people who share his blood, turns out to be the pattern the rest of this story is built on. The elevator doors tried to close twice before someone thought to jam them open with a shoe. Papers from his briefcase scattered across the floor. A merger agreement. A birthday card from a grandchild he hasn't seen in 8 months. A folded receipt from a lunch he ate alone the day before. None of it mattered in the next 90 seconds except the color draining out of his face, and the fact that his chest had stopped rising in any rhythm a body recognizes as normal. By the time the ambulance reached the hospital, his heart had stopped once already in the elevator, and started again only because a guard who'd taken a first aid course 11 years ago remembered what to do with his hands. And in the next 6 hours, doctors would run the scan that led to the sentence you already heard. The first call made from the ambulance isn't to his wife, who passed 3 years earlier, and isn't to either of his children directly. It's to his assistant, a woman named Miss On, who has worked for him for 18 years and knows his medical history better than anyone left alive, a detail that will matter more than it seems right now because it tells you exactly how far his family has drifted from the center of his actual life, and exactly how much of that life has quietly passed through her hands instead of theirs. His son doesn't know yet. His daughter doesn't know yet. The man is sitting alone with a death sentence in his lap, and the 2 people who share his last name are, at this exact hour, on opposite sides of the city, doing things that have absolutely nothing to do with him. His son knows within the hour after that, once Miss On finally makes the second call. Daniel Park is 34 years old, already running 2 of his father's 4 divisions, already the loudest voice in every boardroom he's allowed into. He arrives at the hospital not with flowers, not with fear on his face, but with a lawyer 3 steps behind him and a folder already tucked under his arm. How is he? Daniel asks the nurse, and it's the flatness of the question that tells you something. Not is he okay, not can I see him, but a question phrased the way you'd ask about a shipment that might be delayed. Stable. The nurse says carefully. The doctor wants to speak with the family before anyone goes in. Daniel checks his watch. He has a call in 40 minutes with investors in Singapore, and for one uncomfortable second, standing in that hallway, he does the math on whether he can make both. Nobody in the story is asking you to hate him yet. Just notice it. Notice the math. Ask yourself honestly, if you got the call that a parent had collapsed, would your first instinct be to reach for their hand or reach for a folder? Sit with that question for a second, because this story is about to test exactly that difference in two people who both walk into the same hospital room within the same hour. Doyun has 2 children. Daniel, who runs the numbers and rarely visits without an agenda folded somewhere into the visit. And Grace, 29, who left the family business 4 years ago after a disagreement nobody in the family discusses anymore, and who hasn't spoken to her father directly in over a year outside of holiday texts neither of them means. Grace finds out about the diagnosis from a cousin, not from her father, not from her brother. She sits in her car outside her apartment for 11 minutes before she can make herself dial the hospital, and when she finally reaches her father's room, Daniel is already there. Already talking about power of attorney, already using words like continuity of leadership in a room where his father is still hooked up to a monitor that hasn't finished deciding whether his heart trusts itself yet. He just got the diagnosis 3 hours ago, Grace says, low enough that the nurse in the hallway doesn't hear it. And you're already talking about who signs what. Somebody has to, Daniel says. The board needs certainty. The stock needs certainty. You've been gone 4 years, Grace. You don't know what it takes to hold this together. Doyun says nothing during this exchange. He watches his 2 children argue over him like he's already the subject of an estate rather than a man still breathing in the bed between them, and something in his face changes that neither of his children notices, because neither of them is actually looking at him. Miss On is the only one in the room who is. She has stood in enough of Doyun's rooms over 18 years to have learned exactly what his silences mean, and this one, watching his children speak over him like furniture, is a silence she files away without comment, the way she files away most things, quietly, competently, and entirely on her own judgment of what deserves to be mentioned later and what doesn't. 3 days later, while Doyun is still in the hospital, the board convenes without him for the first time in the company's history. Daniel chairs the meeting. He frames it carefully, a temporary measure. He calls it purely procedural, just enough authority transferred to keep contracts moving while his father recovers. Nobody in the room asks the question that matters most. Recovers from what, exactly, and for how long is temporary actually expected to last? One board member, an older woman who has sat on that board for 22 years and remembers Doyun before any of this success, raises her hand halfway through the vote. Has anyone actually asked Doyun what he wants done with his own authority while he's recovering? The room goes quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when someone says the obvious thing everyone else agreed not to say out loud. Daniel answers smoothly, the way he answers everything, but the pause before he does lasts half a second longer than it should. He's not in a position to be consulted on procedural matters right now, Daniel says. We're protecting the company. That's what he'd want. Nobody in that room has actually asked him. Write that down, because it matters again later. The hospital assigns him a private recovery suite once he's stable enough to leave intensive care, the kind of room with a couch nobody sleeps on, and a window that looks out over a parking garage instead of a view anyone paid for. The cleaning staff rotates through every floor on a schedule nobody upstairs has ever bothered to learn, and on the 3rd morning, a woman named Naya Bennett comes in to empty his trash and wipe down surfaces that are already, technically, clean. She doesn't know who he is. That's the first thing worth noticing. She's not there because of his name on the door or the size of his company. She's there because it's Tuesday and this is her floor. She moves through the room quietly, efficiently, the way a person moves when they've learned not to take up more space than their job requires, and she's almost finished when Doyun, awake and staring at the ceiling, says the first thing he said out loud all morning that isn't about the company. Do you ever get tired of cleaning up after people who don't say thank you? Naya stops, turns, looks at him properly for the first time. Every day, she says. But the trash doesn't care whether I'm tired, so. It's such a small exchange. For sentences, maybe 5. But it's the first time in 3 days that anyone has spoken to Doyun Park like he's a person instead of an asset that needs managing, and something about that lands harder than either of them expects it to in the moment. He watches her finish the room and leave without asking his name, without checking the chart clipped to the door, without any of the careful deference his own employees perform around him every day of his working life. And for reasons he can't quite explain to himself yet, he finds himself hoping it's her cart he hears in the hallway again tomorrow morning. If you've ever felt more seen by a stranger than by your own family in a hard moment, comment the word "seen" below. We want to know how many of you have lived some version of what's happening in this room right now. Naya comes back the next day, and the day after, past the point where her rotation technically requires it. She starts bringing him the newspaper from the break room downstairs, because he mentions once that hospital television makes his head hurt. She learns, without ever being told directly, that he takes his tea with no sugar and extra hot, the way his mother used to make it decades ago in a kitchen none of his children have ever seen a photograph of. He learns things about her too slowly, the way you learn things about someone who isn't used to being asked. That she immigrated 8 years ago. That she works 2 jobs, this one, and a night shift at a laundromat, to send money home to a mother raising her younger siblings. That she hasn't taken a full day off in over a year, not because anyone's forcing her to work that hard, but because stopping means falling behind on numbers that don't forgive falling behind. "You work harder than my own children," Doyun says one evening, only half joking. "Your children have a company to inherit," Naya says, not unkindly. "I have rent." He laughs at that, actually laughs, for what the nurse later tells Grace is the first time anyone's heard him laugh since the diagnosis. Grace, standing in the hallway overhearing it by accident, feels something twist in her chest that she doesn't have a name for yet. Not jealousy exactly, something closer to grief for a version of closeness with her father she never managed to build herself. There's a night, about 2 weeks in, when Doyun can't sleep and Naya is finishing a late rotation on his floor, and he asks her to just sit for a few minutes, not to clean anything, not to do anything, just to be in the room so it doesn't feel as empty as it does at 3 in the morning. She pulls a chair over without being asked twice. They don't talk about anything important. He tells her about the freighter he started with, the one so old the crew used to joke it ran on stubbornness instead of fuel. She tells him about the walk to school she used to take as a girl, 40 minutes each way, past a market that sold mangoes, so ripe you could smell them from 2 streets over. Neither of them mentions it the next morning. But something has shifted, quietly, in the particular way things shift between 2 people who've decided, without saying so, that the other one is safe to be unguarded around. Daniel notices too, when he visits 3 days later and finds a cleaning cart parked outside his father's door for longer than any cleaning cart should reasonably need to be there. He doesn't say anything about it directly, but he makes a note of her name on his phone, the way a man makes a note of anything he considers a variable he hasn't accounted for yet. Miss On notices it before Daniel does. She's the one who mentions, in passing, over paperwork Doyun barely glances at anymore, that a member of the cleaning staff has been spending an unusual amount of time in his room. She says it the way she says most things to him now, lightly, almost like a joke, watching his face carefully while she says it, the way a woman watches for reaction she already suspects is coming. What Daniel does with that note is the part nobody in that hospital room knows about yet. He has an assistant run a basic background check on Naya Bennett. Nothing invasive, he tells himself, just due diligence. The same due diligence he'd run on any new hire near his father in a moment this vulnerable. What comes back 3 days later stops him mid-sentence in his own office. Her last name isn't the one that catches his attention. It's her country of origin. Cross-referenced against old shipping incident logs his assistant pulls up out of habit more than suspicion, a name buried in a decade-old internal report that Daniel himself signed off on when he was 23 years old and desperate to prove he belonged in the company his father built. He doesn't tell his father. He doesn't tell Grace. Instead, he does something that will only make sense later. He quietly requests that hospital administration reassign the cleaning staff on his father's floor, citing security concerns that don't hold up to a single follow-up question, on a Thursday when he knows his father will be sedated for a procedure and unable to ask why the woman who's been visiting him every day for 3 weeks suddenly stopped showing up. Naya finds out about the reassignment from a coworker, not from anyone in the family, and not from any official explanation. She has exactly one guess about why it's happening, and for the first time since she took this job, she has to decide how much she's willing to fight for a place in a room that was never supposed to mean anything to her beyond a paycheck. If you think you already know why Daniel really wants her gone, hold that thought, because the reason isn't the one you're expecting, and we're about to tell you exactly what it is. Here is where the story stops being what you think it is. Because Naya Bennett did not end up on Doyun Park's floor by accident. 8 years ago, before she immigrated, before any of this, her father worked the loading docks of a shipping terminal that carried Park Group cargo out of a port 2 continents away. A safety inspection had flagged a crane mechanism as unsafe 11 months before it failed. The report never reached the people who could have grounded that crane. Her father was standing beneath it when it did. She remembers the exact phone call that told her, remembers the specific static on the line because the connection back home was never good, remembers that she was folding laundry at the time and never touched that particular shirt again because it was the one she was holding when the world rearranged itself. She was 19. She had 2 younger siblings still in school and a mother who didn't speak enough English yet to navigate the paperwork that followed. Naya learned the language, learned the systems, learned exactly how a company insulates itself from a dead man's family, one polite letter at a time, before she ever learned how to grieve him properly. She took this job on this floor, in this hospital, in this city, 3 weeks after learning through an old family contact that Doyun Park himself had checked into this exact wing for treatment. She had planned, for exactly this length of time, to be in this room when the man whose company killed her father finally had to reckon with his own mortality. She had rehearsed, more than once, alone in her apartment, exactly what she would say to him if the moment ever came. None of those rehearsed lines survived the first morning he actually spoke to her like a person instead of a name on a door. She had not planned on him asking if she got tired of people who don't say thank you. She had not planned on the tea, or the laugh, or the particular ache of learning that grief doesn't stay where you put it, even when you've spent years building a very careful box for it. Would you have done what she did? Would you have taken that job, walked into that room, knowing what you knew, and would you have been able to keep hating him once you actually knew him? Sit with that question, because Naya is sitting with it too. Every single day, she keeps showing up on that floor. Before we continue, if this twist caught you off guard, comment, "I didn't see that coming" below, and if you haven't already, hit subscribe because the story is about to turn again, and this next part is the one that changes everything you think you understand about who the real villain in this family actually is. She doesn't go to hospital administration about the reassignment. She goes straight to Doyun's room, past a nurse who tries to stop her, past the general rule that cleaning staff don't get to override a director's request without consequence to their own employment. "Your son had me pulled off this floor 2 days ago," she tells him, standing at the foot of his bed the same way she will days later when the bigger truth finally comes out. "He didn't ask me why I was here so often. He just made a call and made sure I disappeared quietly." Doyun's face goes hard in a way Naya hasn't seen it go before. Why would he do that? "I don't know yet," she says. "But I intend to find out before I let myself get quietly erased from a room I never should have needed permission to be in." He picks up the phone on the nightstand himself, weak as he still is, and calls hospital administration directly, reversing the reassignment in 4 sentences delivered in a voice none of his staff has heard him use since before the diagnosis. It's the first real exercise of his own authority since the elevator, and it happens entirely because a cleaner refused to disappear quietly the way his own son assumed she would. Miss On is standing in the doorway for the second half of that phone call, having come in with paperwork she never ends up handing over. She watches Naya the entire time with an expression that isn't hostility, exactly, and isn't warmth either, something more careful than either. The look of a woman recalculating how much space this new person is going to take up in a life she spent 18 years quietly managing the edges of. She confronts him 3 weeks after she learns the truth herself, not with anger she expects to feel, but with a quiet, exhausted honesty that surprises them both. "My father died under a Park Group crane," she says, standing at the foot of his bed instead of beside it for the first time since she started coming. 11 years ago. There was a report. It never reached anyone who could have stopped it. Doyun goes very still. I don't know what report you're talking about. I believe you, she says, and that surprises him more than an accusation would have. I've spent 3 weeks trying to decide if I believe you, and I do. Which means somebody underneath you buried it and you never found out, and that might be worse. He asks her to find it. Not because he thinks it will change anything for her, but because for the first time in this entire diagnosis, he wants to know something true instead of something convenient, and he no longer has the luxury of pretending 6 more months means there's time to look away from it. What she finds, digging with a determination that has nothing to do with her job description anymore, is a safety audit from 11 years ago with 2 signatures on it. The site supervisor who filed it, and the executive who received it and marked it resolved without any resolution ever taking place. It takes her 4 days of quiet, careful requests to record she technically isn't authorized to access, favors called in from a clerk in the archive department who owes her from a kindness months earlier that had nothing to do with any of this. She reads the audit 3 times before she lets herself believe what the second signature actually says. The second signature belongs to a much younger Daniel Park, 23 years old at the time, 3 months into his first real position in the company, already more concerned with quarterly numbers than a maintenance order that would have cost the division its shipping deadline. She sits with that folder closed on her lap for a long time before she brings it to Doyun, because once she says it out loud, there's no version of his family that gets to stay the same afterward, including whatever she and Doyun have quietly built over these last several weeks. Act 6.5, the second signature. Except the folder the archive clerk hands her isn't thin. It's the kind of thick that makes Naya sit down before she keeps reading, because underneath the Crane audit are 11 more, spanning 9 years, spread across 4 different divisions, each one stamped resolved in the same small, careful handwriting that isn't Daniel's. Daniel's signature only appears on one of them. The handwriting on all 12 is the same. She doesn't recognize it at first. It takes a second trip to the archive, and a comparison against a stack of old scheduling memos the clerk happens to have on hand from a different request entirely before Naya's stomach turns over completely. The handwriting matches the woman who has signed every visitor authorization Naya has filled out for 3 months. The woman who brings Doyun his afternoon medication log. The woman who was standing in the doorway the day Doyun picked up that phone and reversed the reassignment, watching Naya with an expression she'd read, at the time, as simple caution. Miss On had built, over more than a decade, a quiet filtering system around Doyun that nobody on the board ever voted on and nobody in his family ever noticed because it looked from the outside, exactly like devotion. Reports that might upset him during a difficult quarter got held until a better time that kept moving further away. Complaints that might make him doubt a manager he trusted got softened before they ever reached his desk, or didn't reach it at all. She told herself, every single time, that she was protecting a man who worked too hard and trusted too easily, a man who didn't need one more fire to put out when he was already carrying the weight of an entire company on a frame that was never built to hold this much. Somewhere in 18 years of that particular kindness, protecting him quietly turned into deciding for him, and deciding for him turned into a crane that was never grounded because grounding it would have meant walking into his office with bad news during a week he was already exhausted and she had made, without asking anyone, the call that he didn't need to hear it that week. Or the week after. Or the 9 years of weeks that followed, until it stopped feeling like a decision at all and started feeling like simply how the office ran. Naya doesn't confront her first. She sits with it for 2 full days, turning it over the same careful way she once turned over the decision to take this job at all, because this discovery costs her something different than Daniel's did. Daniel is a stranger to her, easy to be angry at. Miss On brought her coffee last week without being asked, remembered how she takes it, asked once, gently, how her mother was doing back home. It is one thing to learn that the son buried a single report at 23, panicked and unformed. It is another thing entirely to learn that the gatekeeper standing quietly beside Doyun's bed every single day for 18 years has been the one actually deciding, folder by folder, which truths he was allowed to carry. Doyun calls his son into the hospital room the next morning, the folder open on the blanket across his knees, and for the first time in longer than either of them can remember, Daniel walks in without a lawyer 3 steps behind him. "Explain this to me," Doyun says, sliding the folder toward him. Daniel goes pale reading it, the kind of pale that isn't performance. That was 11 years ago. I was 23. I didn't understand what a delay like that would cost. A man died under that crane, Doyun says, and his voice doesn't rise, which somehow makes it worse. A man with children, one of whom has been changing my sheets and bringing me tea for the last month while I had no idea her father's death had my company's name on it. Daniel doesn't defend himself the way Doyun expects him to. He sits down instead, folder still in his hands, and for a long moment says nothing at all. The silence of a man who has spent 11 years telling himself a story convenient enough to live inside, finally watching that story collapse in front of the one person whose opinion he never stopped needing. I was going to tell you eventually, he says quietly, when I thought you could actually hear it without it costing me everything. Eventually, Doyun says, is a word men use to describe cowardice they haven't found the nerve to call by its real name yet. Daniel sits with that for a long moment, the folder still open on his knees, and something in him that's been rehearsed and defended for 11 years finally cracks under the weight of his own father saying it plainly instead of a lawyer softening it into something survivable. I had you reassign her floor because I was afraid of exactly this conversation, he admits. Not because I thought she was dangerous. Because I knew that if she stayed close enough to you long enough, eventually you'd find out what I did, and I wasn't ready to lose whatever was left of how you see me. You didn't lose it by doing something wrong at 23, Doyun says. You're losing it right now at 34 by still trying to manage the story instead of just telling me the truth of it. Daniel doesn't have an answer for that. For the first time since he was a teenager, he sits in a room with his father and doesn't try to fill the silence with a plan. It's Naya, still standing near the door with a thicker folder pressed flat against her side, who finally says the part nobody else in the room has said yet. He isn't the only signature in there, she says. Doyun looks at her, then at the folder in her hands, and something in his expression tells her he already suspects, in the half-second before she says the name, exactly whose handwriting he's about to have to recognize. Miss On is called in 20 minutes later, and she doesn't deny it, doesn't reach for a lawyer or a version of events softened enough to survive the room. She stands the way she stood beside his bed for 18 years, hands folded, and tells him, plainly, that she made a decision a long time ago that it was her job to protect him from the things that would break him faster than the work already was, and that somewhere in 18 years of making that decision quietly, without ever once asking him if he wanted it made on his behalf, she stopped being able to tell the difference between protecting him and simply deciding, on her own, what kind of man he got to be. You let a man die so I wouldn't have a hard week, Doyun says, and it isn't a question. I let 11 men have hard years so you wouldn't, she says, and it's the only time in 18 years anyone in that family has heard her voice break. I never once told myself it was about the company. I told myself it was about you. I need you to know that was never a lie, even though I understand now it was never an excuse either. If you've ever had to confront someone you loved with a truth that changed how you saw them completely, comment, I understand below, because what happens in the rest of this family over the next several months is going to ask exactly that question of every person in this room, including the one who's been standing quietly in the corner of it for 18 years. Doyun outlives the 6 months. Whether it's the treatment, or the will to face something true for the first time in over a decade, or simply the particular stubbornness that built a shipping empire out of one rusted freighter, nobody can say for certain, and the doctors are careful not to promise anything they can't stand behind. What's certain is that 6 months after the diagnosis, he's still here, thinner, slower, but present in a way his family has not seen him be present in years. He doesn't fire Daniel. He does something Daniel doesn't expect and doesn't fully understand until much later. He requires him to sit across from the families of every worker the buried reports ever put at risk, not with lawyers, not with settlements negotiated to minimize damage, but in person, hearing what 11 years of silence actually cost people who were never given the choice to know the risk they were working under. The first meeting is the hardest. Daniel sits across a folding table from a widow who lost her husband to a mechanism nearly identical to the one that killed Naya's father in a terminal 3,000 miles from where it happened. She doesn't yell at him. She just tells him, plainly, what the last 11 years have looked like: raising 2 children on a survivor's pension that barely covers rent, and Daniel, who has spent his entire adult life measuring outcomes in quarterly percentages, sits there with nothing in his hands to measure this against. He goes to 4 more of these meetings that month, and something in the way he carries himself afterward starts to change in ways his father notices before he says anything about it out loud. It isn't redemption, not yet, not fully. But it's the first honest work Daniel Park has done in 11 years that isn't aimed at protecting himself. Miss On doesn't get the same assignment. She isn't fired, either, though half the board expects it and one member says so directly. In a closed session, Doyun ends after 4 minutes. What Doyun does instead is quieter and, in its own way, harder. He removes her entirely from anything touching decisions about what he does or doesn't need to see, and hands that responsibility to no one at all, insisting that from now on, everything comes to him directly, unfiltered, whether it's convenient for that week or not. She keeps her position. She keeps her office. But the particular authority she built for herself over 18 years, one quiet, withheld report at a time, is gone, and everyone in the building understands exactly why without a single memo ever being sent explaining it. Naya's mother receives a letter from the company, and inside it isn't a check written to by silence the way it once might have been. It's an acknowledgement, plain and specific, of what happened and who failed to stop it, sent not because a lawyer required it, but because Doyun insisted the truth be spoken in writing before he'd let himself feel like he'd made anything right at all. Grace comes back into the family's daily life slowly, the way people come back to something they left because it hurt too much to stay. She starts visiting without an agenda, the way Naya once did, and eventually the 2 women find themselves in the same hospital corridor often enough that what starts as polite recognition becomes something closer to friendship. 2 people who both, in their own separate ways, ended up caring for a man neither of them expected to matter to them this much. I used to think loving him meant proving something to him, Grace tells Naya one evening, watching through the window as her father sleeps. Turns out it just meant showing up when it was inconvenient. Naya doesn't answer right away. She's still working through what loving him, or something adjacent to it, even means for her, given everything he represents and everything he's turned out to actually be. But she nods, because some truths land the same way no matter which door you walked in through to find them. Grace tells her, eventually, about the disagreement that kept her away from the family for 4 years, and this is the part Naya doesn't expect. It wasn't only about the company's direction, the way Daniel always framed it to anyone who asked. For years ago, Grace had come across a pattern in the shipping incident numbers that didn't sit right with her. Nothing as specific as a name or a signature, just a shape in the data that looked wrong to someone who'd grown up around these numbers her whole life. She'd brought it to Miss On first, the way she brought most things to her father in those years, because Miss On had always been the easiest door into a house that otherwise required an appointment. Miss On told her she'd look into it, told her not to worry her father with something that vague while he was in the middle of the biggest acquisition of his career, told her, kindly, the way she told everyone everything, that she'd handle it. Grace never heard about it again. She assumed, for 4 years, that it had turned out to be nothing, or that her father had looked into it and found it wasn't worth mentioning, and the not knowing curdled slowly into a different fight entirely, the one the family still doesn't like to name, about whether she'd ever really mattered enough in that company for her concerns to go anywhere at all. He never even heard about it. Naya says quietly, understanding now exactly which folder that concern had probably ended up filed inside of, exactly whose handwriting had likely closed it before it ever reached the desk Grace assumed it had reached. I know that now, Grace says. I found out 3 weeks ago, same as you probably did. For years, Naya. For years I told myself he just didn't care enough to answer me, when the truth is he never even got the question. Naya listens the way she's learned to listen to Doyun, without rushing to fix what someone else is still in the middle of feeling. There's a particular kind of grief in it that she recognizes from the inside, not just what was done, but everything a person quietly decides about themselves in the silence that follows, the years spent believing a door was closed on purpose, when it turns out it was simply never opened at all. He's different now, Naya says finally. Not fixed. Different. I know, Grace says. I keep waiting to stop being surprised by it, and I haven't yet. There comes a day when Doyun, stronger now than anyone expected him to be at this point, offers Naya something that isn't a job and isn't charity, a position overseeing worker safety compliance across every park group terminal worldwide, reporting to him directly, with authority nobody in the company, not even Daniel, not even whoever eventually sits in Miss On's old gatekeeping role, is permitted to filter or override. You don't have to say yes, he tells her. I know exactly what accepting this would mean you'd be doing every day, carrying my company's failure on your back for the rest of your career. She doesn't answer him right away. She goes home that night and sits with the offer the same way she once sat with the decision to take a cleaning job in a hospital wing 3 continents away from where her father died, turning it over, weighing what it would cost her to say yes against what it would cost her to walk away, and let someone else decide how carefully the next report gets read. She calls her mother, who asks only one question. Would her father have wanted her spending her life still standing guard over his death, or finally living past it? Naya doesn't have a clean answer for that either, not that night. I've been carrying it since I was 19 years old, she tells Doyun the next morning. The only difference now is whether I get to actually do something about it. She says yes. Not because it erases what happened to her father. Nothing erases that, and the story doesn't pretend otherwise, but because for the first time, the man responsible for the silence around his death is finally willing to spend whatever time he has left making sure that particular silence, and whoever gets quietly appointed to guard it next time, never happens to anyone else's family again. If you were in Naya's position, would you have said yes? Would you have been able to work for the very company that took your father from you, even knowing the man at the top was finally trying to make it right? Comment your honest answer below. We read every single one, and we'd genuinely love to know where you land on this. Doyun Park is still alive as of this telling, past the 6 months, past the 8, into a stretch of time his doctors describe carefully as longer than expected, and nothing more certain than that. He spends most mornings now in a smaller office than the one he used to occupy, reviewing safety reports himself before anyone else's signature goes anywhere near them, refusing, even on the mornings it exhausts him, to let a single one pass through anyone's hands but his own first. Daniel sits 2 floors below him, rebuilding something neither father nor son has a name for yet, one honest report at a time. Grace visits on Sundays, no agenda, just coffee and the particular quiet of 2 people who finally stopped performing family and started actually being one. And Naya still stops by that same hospital wing sometimes, not because her job requires it anymore, but because a friendship built out of grief, and tea with no sugar doesn't end just because the circumstances that started it did. There are still hard days. Doyun's body reminds him often that 6 months was never a guarantee revoked, only a guess extended, and some mornings he can't get out of bed without help, and some mornings Naya is the one who provides it, quietly, the way she once emptied a trash can in a room that didn't yet know who she really was to him. Daniel still catches himself, some weeks, slipping back into the old instinct to manage a room instead of sit honestly inside it, and it's usually Grace, now, who calls him on it before their father has to. Miss On still works in that building, still answers the phone the same steady way she has for 18 years, and there is, if you know to listen for it, a particular carefulness in how she asks Doyun questions now instead of simply deciding the answers for him, a woman relearning, slowly and without much grace, what devotion is supposed to look like when it doesn't come with a filter attached. The Safety Compliance Division Naya now oversees has already grounded 2 pieces of equipment at terminals overseas that would have gone unflagged under the old reporting structure, equipment that, under the previous version of this company, would have kept running until something or someone underneath it eventually forced the truth out the hard way. Nobody throws a celebration for a disaster that never happens. But somewhere, workers who will never know her name go home to their families tonight because a woman who lost her own father to exactly this kind of silence refused to let the next report disappear into a drawer, or a folder, or the careful, well-meaning judgment of anyone standing quietly between a man and the truth he was never actually asked if he wanted protected from. What this story asks, in the end, isn't whether a dying man can change. Plenty of stories ask that question, and plenty answer it easily. What it asks is whether the people around him are willing to tell him the truth in time for that change to actually mean something, and whether the people who love someone the most are always the ones most tempted to decide, quietly and on their own, which truths that person is strong enough to carry. Doyun Park got that chance because one woman refused to let a folder full of buried paperwork stay buried any longer, even when silence would have been so much easier for her too, and even when the person she eventually had to hold accountable for it was someone who'd brought her coffee just the week before. Ask yourself, honestly, one more time before this story ends, how many truths are sitting in your own family right now, in a folder somebody's decided isn't worth opening yet, not out of malice, but out of a kind of love that convinced itself silence was the safer gift? And what would it cost the people you love if you waited as long as this family did to finally open it? If this story moved you, we'd genuinely love to know. How would you have handled learning what Naya learned, sitting in that hospital room every single day? Would you have stayed as long as she did, or walked away the moment you had the truth in your hands? Let us know in the comments, and if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss the next story we tell, because some of the most important truths in any family are the ones nobody wants to be the first to say out loud.